Daniel had always been the kind of person who gave his all. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave. Whether it was in college at his internship or during his first job, he believed that hard work was the golden key to success. But life had different plans. At 27, Daniel launched his dream startup, an app that aimed to connect volunteers to local NGOs through a seamless interface. He invested all his savings, time, and even took loans from friends and family. The idea felt revolutionary. The launch day was perfect, and initial feedback was great. But just 6 months later, the cracks began to show. A bigger competitor released a similar app, better funded, more features, and a massive marketing team. Daniel's app, although built with heart, couldn't compete. Within a year, it was all over. He had to shut it down. The calls stopped. The investors went silent. Friends who once cheered him on began to whisper behind his back. Every time he looked at his phone, there were no notifications. The silence was deafening. Daniel slipped into a spiral of self-doubt. He questioned every decision he had made. Was I foolish to believe I could change the world? Or why didn't I see the competition coming? Or what would people think of me now? He stopped meeting people. He avoided events. He hated the mirror because it reflected not just his face, but what he saw as failure. But amidst the silence, something else began to stir, a whisper in his soul. Failure, it said, is not the end. It's a beginning. It took weeks, then months for Daniel to even entertain that thought. But it stayed with him like a flicker in a dark room. Daniel finally decided to stop running from the truth. He pulled out his old journal, the one he used during his startup journey, and began reading through the pages, the passion, the enthusiasm, the moments of victory, and the moments of confusion. It was all there. And as he read, he realized something profound. The failure wasn't in the idea. The failure wasn't in his effort. The failure was in not preparing for resilience. He had built an app, but he hadn't built a plan B. He had chased growth, but he hadn't studied the market's volatility. He had poured his soul into the product, but ignored the business side. And so Daniel started taking notes, not on what went wrong in terms of blame, but what he could learn. He realized he had never truly understood financial runway. He didn't engage with mentors enough. He didn't build a community of support beyond initial hype. More importantly, he noticed that even when his app was struggling, there were a few organizations that truly benefited. They still sent him emails of appreciation, even months after it shut down. That meant something. That was real. He printed out one such email and pinned it to his wall. It read, Redform helped us get 10 volunteers in just 2 weeks. We're still grateful. Daniel looked at it every morning, and every morning he reminded himself, you did something that mattered. That became the foundation of his healing. With fresh perspective and notes filled with reflections, Daniel didn't immediately launch another startup. No, this time he wanted to build himself first. He joined a local business club and started attending startup talks, not as a speaker, but as a listener. He reached out to his former critics and asked them genuinely, what could I have done better? Some ignored him, but a few responded, and their honesty stung, but it also helped. One investor said, you didn't ask for help when you needed it. You tried to carry everything alone. Another said, you were great at vision, but you never built a strong team around you. Daniel wrote it all down. He started reading more. He took online courses in marketing, finance, and team leadership. He volunteered part-time with a nonprofit, one of the NGO who once used his app. He watched closely how they operated, how they built connections without massive budgets, and how they grew trust among their audience. 6 months passed, then a year, and Daniel felt ready again. But this time, he wasn't chasing a trend or building a flashy product. He was solving a real problem. He built a smaller platform focused only on local volunteer groups, no flashy design, just pure, easy utility. He didn't take loans. He bootstrapped. He didn't launch to the world. He launched to a community of 100 NGO who had helped him rebuild his confidence. And this time he listened. Every suggestion, every complaint, every idea, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And slowly, growth returned, not viral, not explosive, but steady, strong, genuine. Daniel had transformed from a broken dreamer into a resilient doer, not by ignoring failure, but by understanding it and using it as the foundation to rebuild. stronger, wiser, unbroken. Ethan stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment, replaying the harsh words spoken to him just hours earlier. You're not good enough, Ethan. Maybe this isn't for you. The sting of criticism from people he once admired echoed in his mind, tightening around his dreams like a vice. But something inside him refused to let go. He clenched his fist, breathing deeply. Criticism had followed him for as long as he could remember. In school, teachers doubted his ideas. In college, peers laughed at his ambitious dreams. And now, after pouring every ounce of effort into launching his own business, he faced another wall of disbelief. But Ethan wasn't the same person he used to be. He remembered the days he spent sleeping on a worn-out mattress, working late into the night on his ideas, powered only by hope and instant noodles. Those memories weren't signs of failure. They were proof of how far he'd come. Instead of collapsing under the weight of rejection, Ethan leaned into it, and he turned every criticism into fuel. When someone said his idea lacked vision, he refined it. When they said he lacked leadership, he studied communication, watched TED Talks, practiced in front of a mirror. Every no became a roadmap to the next yes. People around him noticed. The same critics who once dismissed him started asking questions, seeking advice. They saw in Ethan not just a businessman, but a man who wouldn't break. He proved that the most powerful way to silence doubt isn't by arguing, but by building something undeniable. When Ethan felt the world pressing in too hard, he didn't retreat alone anymore. After one particularly rough investor pitch where a panel of seasoned professionals mocked his business plan, Ethan left feeling crushed. He wandered into a quiet cafe, defeated and questioning everything. That's when an old friend, Marcus, spotted him. They hadn't spoken in months, but Marcus knew that look. Rough day? Marcus asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Ethan managed to nod, eyes downcast. Without a word, Marcus ordered 2 coffees and just sat there. He didn't rush Ethan to speak or offer unsolicited advice. He simply showed up, and that simple gesture sparked something important in Ethan's journey. He began reaching out more to friends, former mentors, and people he trusted. He formed a small group that met once a week, not just to talk business, but to encourage each other. Each person came with their own battles, but within that circle, they found strength. There was Maya, who had failed her startup 3 times, but never lost her fire. There was Joe, a single dad rebuilding his career from scratch. Each story reminded Ethan that success wasn't about walking alone. It was about rising together. He started collaborating more, asking for help when needed, and offering it in return. The walls of pride he once held began to crack, replaced by bridges built on empathy and mutual support. That network didn't just uplift Ethan emotionally. It opened doors to resources, knowledge, and opportunities he could never have accessed alone. Through them, he found new investors who believed in his mission, not just the numbers. Ethan realized that behind every comeback is often a community, quiet warriors who hold you up when you can't stand on your own. Ethan once believed that mistakes were proof of inadequacy. He used to replay every misstep in his mind, letting guilt and shame linger far longer than they should. But that mindset changed the day he almost lost everything. During the 3rd year of running his company, Ethan made a critical decision based on poor data. It cost the company nearly 6 months of progress and a significant chunk of capital. His team was shaken. He was devastated. He locked himself in his office that night, staring at spreadsheets and trying to rewrite history. But no amount of overthinking could change what had already been done. What he could change, though, was what came next. The following morning, Ethan called a full team meeting. Wow. Everyone expected excuses, blame, or panic. Instead, Ethan stood in front of them and said, "I messed up, but I've learned, and here's how we fix it." He walked them through the error, what led to it, and most importantly, what systems they'd implement to ensure it never happened again. That moment transformed Ethan in the eyes of his team, not because he was perfect, but because he was honest, accountable, and growth-minded. Ethan began documenting his mistakes like lessons in a journal. He called it his playbook of failures. Instead of hiding his past, he shared it at conferences, webinars, and even podcasts. His story resonated not just because he succeeded, but because he stumbled, got up, and kept walking. The more Ethan embraced his missteps, the more they began to shape him into a wiser, more resilient leader. He realized mistakes weren't setbacks, they were stepping stones with hidden lessons carved into them. Through every wrong turn, Ethan found new directions, deeper clarity, and unexpected wisdom. He understood now that failure isn't what defines us, it's what refines us. After months of disappointment and silence, Ryan stood before his old high school auditorium. It wasn't a fancy event or a big stage, just a community gathering, small chairs, faded banners, and a few eager faces in the crowd. But for Ryan, it was the beginning of something powerful. A chance to use his story of failure as fuel to inspire others, a chance to turn his pain into purpose. 2 years ago, Ryan had watched his dream startup crumble to the ground. He had poured every waking hour and every ounce of belief into it. He had envisioned it transforming lives, but instead it barely made it out of the first phase. Investors pulled out. His friends distanced themselves. People laughed behind his back. He felt like a public example of what not to do. But as he stood in front of those students now, he smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had learned to use it. He shared every detail, the nights he cried on the floor, wondering why he wasn't good enough, the rejections that made him question his worth, and the moment he realized he had two choices, stay broken or rebuild from scratch. He told them how he started mentoring teens not for money, but to find purpose again, how helping others made him feel human again, how he used his failure to connect, to reach out to others who were on the edge of giving up. There was a silence in the room as he finished his story. Then applause. Not the kind that comes from being impressed, but the kind that comes from being moved, from understanding, from feeling seen. After the event, a young boy named Ethan walked up to him, tears in his eyes. He said, "I was going to quit everything today. I thought I was worthless, and it wasn't. But now I think maybe I can try one more time." Ryan placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Trying one more time is how you change your life," he said softly. Ryan walked out of the building into the cool evening air. He didn't have millions in his bank. He didn't have a fancy office or global fame. But he had something greater, a story that saved someone else's tomorrow, a failure that gave birth to a new kind of success. And that was enough. James woke up early one morning with a heavy heart. Life had been challenging, and he felt overwhelmed by the burdens on his shoulders. Despite his struggles, he decided to step outside for a walk, seeking solace in the cool morning air. The world around him was waking up, and for the first time in days, he felt a faint sense of hope stir within him. As James walked, he noticed a young girl sitting by a park bench. She was carefully folding paper into intricate shapes. Curiosity pulled him closer, and he struck up a conversation. Her name was Lily, and she was creating origami birds. When James asked why she was doing this, Lily smiled and said, "Each bird carries a wish for someone in need. I believe if we focus on giving hope to others, we find hope for ourselves." Her words stayed with James long after their conversation ended. The next day, James returned to the park, inspired by Lily's simple yet profound philosophy. He brought with him a notebook and a pen, determined to list everything he was grateful for, no matter how small. As he wrote, he realized that even in his struggles, there were moments of joy and kindness that he had overlooked. James began sharing his story with others, encouraging them to find hope and gratitude in their lives. To his surprise, his small acts of positivity started a ripple effect. Strangers began reaching out to him, sharing their struggles and victories, creating a supportive and inspiring community. One day, a man named Peter approached James. Peter shared how he had been on the verge of giving up until he stumbled upon one of James's stories online. "You reminded me that even in darkness, there's a spark of light if we look for it," Peter said, his eyes brimming with gratitude. James realized that his purpose was not just to overcome his challenges, but to be a beacon of light for others. He learned that no act of kindness or encouragement was ever too small. Through these experiences, James discovered that life's challenges were not meant to break him, but to shape him into someone stronger, kinder, and more resilient. And so, James continued his journey, not just for himself, but for everyone seeking hope, proving that even the smallest step can lead to extraordinary change. Jacob sat on the edge of the stage, staring at the crowd that had gathered to hear him speak. Just 5 years ago, he was in a completely different place, lost, defeated, broken by failure after his startup collapsed under the weight of poor decisions and unmet expectations. But here he was now being introduced as a guest speaker at an international leadership summit. As the applause faded, Jacob stepped up to the microphone. He didn't wear the polished mask of success. Instead, he spoke with raw honesty. He shared how he had poured everything he had, money, time, relationships, into his dream, only to see it all vanish. He talked about the sleepless nights, the regret, and the deep questioning of his own worth. But he also talked about what came next, the small steps he took, the lessons he learned, the people who stood by him, and the quiet resilience that began to build in him like a slow, steady flame. He told them how he got a part-time job at a bookstore just to make ends meet. He told them how he started reading again, books on mindset, business, failure, success. He told them how those words became the fuel that helped him rebuild himself from the inside out. The crowd listened, silent and wide-eyed, not because Jacob was extraordinary, but because he was real. He wasn't preaching. He was connecting. He wasn't showcasing a flawless journey, but revealing the scars and how they led him to healing. And that's what people needed, someone who had fallen and gotten back up, not by magic, but by persistence and heart. After the talk, a young woman named Sarah approached him. She had tears in her eyes as she shared how her business had just failed and she was considering giving up entirely. But hearing Jacob's story made her feel understood. She wasn't alone anymore. That's the power of sharing your journey. It doesn't just liberate you from the burden of keeping it inside. It opens the door for someone else to believe that they too can rise again. Jacob realized then that every scar he carried had a purpose, not just to remind him of his strength, but to light the path for others. In telling his story, Jacob didn't just recount the past. He rewrote it into a narrative of hope, resilience, and transformation. And for those who listened, that made all the difference. The sun filtered through the window of Ethan's tiny studio apartment. On the wall was a framed photo, not of him receiving an award or standing on a podium, but a simple snapshot of the day he paid off his final debt after years of struggling through financial failure. To someone else, it might not seem like a big deal, but to Ethan, it was everything. He had once lived in a 3-bedroom house, drove a luxury car, and owned a company with 15 employees. And then a single market crash wiped it all out. What followed were 2 brutal years of unemployment, sleepless nights, and hard conversations with family and friends. Ethan had hit rock bottom. But over time, with resilience and humility, he began to crawl out. He took small freelance jobs, learned new skills, and slowly rebuilt his income stream. And when that final payment cleared, it felt like a weight he'd been carrying for years was finally lifted. He bought that cheap frame, printed that photo, and hung it on his wall. It wasn't a symbol of wealth or status. It was a trophy of survival, of perseverance, of triumph over despair. Ethan began celebrating small wins more consciously after that moment. Each time he met a personal goal, he took a moment to acknowledge it. Whether it was waking up early for a week straight, completing a course online, or receiving a thank you message from a client, he celebrated. Not with lavish gifts or grand gestures, but with quiet gratitude and pride. This shift in mindset transformed his entire journey. The road to a comeback often feels endless, especially when measured only by large milestones. But by celebrating the small victories, Ethan stayed motivated. Each win, no matter how minor, became fuel for the next step forward. One day, Ethan was asked to mentor a group of young entrepreneurs. He shared with them that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's part of the same path. And he reminded them to recognize every inch of progress they make, because every comeback begins with believing that even the smallest step counts. As they clapped, Ethan smiled, not because he had reached the top again, but because he finally understood the value of the climb itself. His comeback wasn't just about rebuilding what was lost. It was about becoming someone stronger, wiser, and more grateful along the way. And that made his story worth celebrating.